8 years old. Chloe was less of a child and more of a localized weather event. Her knees were permanently patterned with scrapes. Her hair held an impressive collection of twigs from the oak trees she claimed as her personal territory, and she possessed a laugh that could terrify small animals. Her father, a man whose entire professional life revolved around maintaining the pristine, unshakable public image of the prestigious master of the estate, looked at his daughter and saw his impending retirement funding evaporating. He was the ultimate right-hand man, calm, calculating, and impeccably dressed. His daughter, conversely, looked like she had just been successfully raised by a pack of particularly chaotic bush animals. "You are going to the main house," her father announced one chaotic Saturday afternoon, gently but firmly detaching Chloe from a high window frame. "And you are going to interact with the master's children. They are 10. They speak 3 languages. They do not, to my knowledge, eat dirt." "But they're boring," Chloe complained, kicking her legs. "They wear shoes inside the house, Papa." "Who does that?" "People with manners," her father sighed, rubbing his temples where a headache was actively forming. "People I hope you will copy. Consider this a diplomatic mission. If you manage not to bite either of them, I will buy you that new sketchpad." The diplomatic mission was a catastrophe from minute one. When Chloe was marched into the pristine, pastel-accented courtyard of the main mansion, she was introduced to the master's twin sons. They were immaculate and looked like they had been ironed into existence. The more vocal of the two, Julian, looked down his 10-year-old nose at her with a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. Chloe was wearing a mismatched t-shirt and had a smear of charcoal on her cheek. Julian was wearing a crisp linen shirt that cost more than her entire wardrobe. "Father said we have to let her play with us," the quieter twin Adrian murmured, looking slightly apprehensive. "She looks like she rolls in the mud for fun," Julian countered, crossing his arms. "Can she even speak properly?" Chloe bared her teeth in what she intended to be a terrifying grin. "I can climb higher than you, I can run faster than you, and if you don't shut up, I'll put a caterpillar down your fancy shirt." Julian gasped, taking a horrified step back as if she were a wild creature that had just breached the perimeter. Her father buried his face in his hands, muttering a silent prayer for his career. But the gauntlet had been thrown. Chloe wasn't going to be tamed by a pair of preppy 10-year-olds. And Julian was determined to prove that civilized behavior would always triumph over her brand of backyard anarchy. It was the beginning of a beautiful, absolutely exhausting war. Chapter 1. A full year had passed since the commencement of what Chloe's father officially dubbed the Integration Project, and what Chloe personally referred to as prison. At 9 years old, Chloe had learned a few things about the main estate. She knew exactly which floorboards in the grand hallway creaked. She knew the chef hid the good chocolate chips behind the organic oats. And she knew that Julian, now 11, was still the most insufferable human being on the planet. Their dynamic over the past 12 months had settled into a state of mutually assured destruction. If Julian accidentally locked her out of the solarium during a rainstorm, Chloe would accidentally replace his expensive hair gel with a very similar-looking, mild craft glue. It was a delicate, exhausting ecosystem. It was a perfectly sunny Tuesday afternoon when the fragile ecosystem completely collapsed. Chloe was currently occupying the lower branches of the massive oak tree that bordered the eastern edge of the estate. It was technically out of bounds, which naturally made it her favorite spot. Below, Julian and his quieter twin Adrian were playing a highly structured, intensely boring game of croquet on the manicured lawn. Julian, wearing a pristine white polo shirt, was in the middle of a self-satisfied lecture about the proper angle of a mallet swing. "You have to account for the wind resistance, Adrian," Julian was saying, sounding exactly like a miniature, slightly more annoying version of his billionaire father. "It's basic phys." Julian's lecture was violently interrupted by a low, rumbling growl. From the bushes near the perimeter gate, which someone had carelessly left unlatched, emerged a dog. It wasn't a cute, fluffy neighborhood pet. This was a massive, wiry, muscle-bound stray that looked like it had survived 3 wars and a famine. It locked eyes with Julian's bright white polo shirt, let out a vicious snarl and lunged. Adrian yelped and scrambled up the nearest stone fountain. Julian, for all his 3 languages and impeccable manners, completely froze. His mallet slipped from his hands, his eyes went wide with pure panic, and he let out a distinctly undignified, high-pitched shriek as the dog snapped its jaws just inches from his expensive loafers. Up in the oak tree, Chloe didn't even think. She just reacted. She kicked off her left sneaker, a heavy rubber-soled menace of a shoe, and hurled it with the precision of an Olympic shot putter. The shoe sailed through the air and struck the aggressive dog squarely on the snout with a loud thwack. The dog paused, deeply offended, shaking its head. It looked up at the tree, caught sight of a wild-haired 9-year-old baring her teeth like a rabid squirrel, decided this particular piece of territory was cursed, and bolted back out the gate. Silence descended over the lawn. Julian was breathing hard, his immaculate hair slightly ruffled, staring at the spot where he had almost lost a leg. He looked up at the oak tree. Chloe stared back down at him, 1 foot bare, her arms crossed defensively. "You threw your shoe," Julian breathed, his voice lacking its usual arrogant drawl. "You were just standing there like a decorative lawn gnome," Chloe shot back, scrambling down the trunk with practiced ease. She hopped on 1 foot over to her sneaker, picked it up, and slid it back on. Julian swallowed hard. He looked at the gate, then back at her. For the first time in a year, the disdain in his eyes was replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. "I suppose I should say thank you." Chloe narrowed her eyes, immediately suspicious. "Are you sick? Do you have a fever?" "I'm being polite," Julian snapped, his usual prickliness returning, though a bit forced. He dusted off his polo shirt, trying to regain his composure. "You saved my life." "I saved your shoes," Chloe corrected. The dog clearly wanted the leather. Adrian finally climbed down from the fountain, looking between the two of them. "Does this mean we don't have to hate each other today?" Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked at Chloe, who was currently picking a piece of bark out of her elbow. "Come to the kitchen," he muttered, looking away. "Chef Pierre just made a fresh batch of those raspberry tarts. The ones you keep stealing." Chloe's eyes lit up. "The ones with the powdered sugar?" "Yes," Julian said, turning toward the mansion. He paused and glanced over his shoulder. "And I'll tell Pierre to let you have the first one." It wasn't a declaration of friendship. It certainly wasn't the end of their war. But as Chloe fell into step beside the pristine twins, tracking a small amount of oak tree debris onto the immaculate patio stones, a silent treaty had been signed. Julian knew she had his back in a crisis, and Chloe knew he was good for top-tier pastry smuggling. It was a start. Chapter 2. 2 years after the Treaty of the Oak Tree, an uneasy peace had largely held. Chloe was now 11, and the twins were 13, which meant they had officially entered the horrifying territory of middle school. For Chloe, middle school meant more complex math, a wider variety of trees to climb, and a growing disdain for social expectations. For Julian, it meant a hyper-awareness of status, a sudden obsession with cologne that smelled strongly of pine needles, and the belief that he was the foremost authority on everything. This clash of ideologies reached a boiling point in the second week of May, courtesy of the Oak Ridge Academy Spring Mixer. It was a semi-formal event that the children of the estate's inner circle were heavily encouraged to attend. Chloe's father had handed her a crisp invitation with a look that clearly communicated, "Please, for the love of my sanity, do not embarrass us." "I'm wearing my lucky cargo pants," Chloe announced the day before the mixer, aggressively chewing on a piece of licorice while sitting on the velvet sofa in the twins' private game room. Julian, who was carefully polishing a silver watch he had zero practical need for, paused. He looked up, his expression one of profound horror. "You absolutely are not." "They have 8 pockets, Julian," Chloe argued, crossing her arms. "Where else am I supposed to keep my emergency snacks? A purse? Purses are a structural vulnerability." "It's a semi-formal mixer, Chloe. You can't wear cargo pants." Adrian chimed in gently from the corner, where he was reading. "People will stare." "Let them stare," she declared. "Absolutely not," Julian said, standing up and pointing a perfectly manicured finger at her. "My father is hosting the VIP parents tomorrow night, which means your father will be there, which means we all have to look like a cohesive, respectable unit. If you show up looking like a rogue park ranger, it reflects poorly on me." "Everything reflects poorly on you," Chloe shot back. "I am stepping in," Julian announced, completely ignoring her insult. "Adrian and I will procure an acceptable garment for you. You will wear it, you will not complain, and you will leave the cargo pants in the darkest corner of your closet where they belong." Chloe should have fought harder, but Julian had promised her unrestricted access to the estate's arcade room for a month if she complied, so she begrudgingly agreed. This was a colossal mistake. When the dress arrived the next afternoon in a sleek garment bag, Chloe unzipped it and immediately hissed like a threatened cat. It was pastel. Not just pastel, but a violently frothy, cotton candy pink nightmare made of entirely too much tulle. It had ruffled cap sleeves, a giant satin bow at the waist, and came with matching painfully stiff flats. "I look like a heavily armed cupcake," Chloe snarled an hour later, standing rigidly in the grand foyer. She tugged at the itchy tool around her collarbone. Julian, dressed in a sharply tailored miniature tuxedo, looked her up and down with smug satisfaction. You look civilized. Try not to ruin it by slouching. The mixer itself was held in the Academy's grand hall, complete with a sprawling buffet and a massive, crystal punch bowl filled with a dubious, bright red fruit concoction. Chloe spent the first hour standing stiffly in a corner, terrified that if she moved too quickly, the satin bow would untie itself and strangle her. She was miserable, itchy, and craving a heavily salted pretzel. Julian, meanwhile, was in his element, schmoozing with the other wealthy teenagers. Every time he passed Chloe's corner, he shot her a triumphant, patronizing little smirk. By hour 2, Chloe had reached her breaking point. She limped over to the refreshment table, her feet screaming in the stiff flats, desperate for a drink. As she reached for a plastic cup, a familiar pine-scented presence materialized beside her. Having fun? Julian asked smoothly, leaning against the table. You've barely moved. I suppose the dress is successfully restricting your feral tendencies. Julian, Chloe warned, her voice dangerously low. Walk away. I'm just saying, he continued, a teasing glint in his eye. It's nice to see you acting like a proper young lady for once, even if you do look like you're about to vibrate out of your own skin. He reached out and smugly flicked the giant satin bow on her waist. That was it. The thread of Chloe's patience completely snapped. She didn't yell. She didn't even glare. With the swift, practiced reflex of someone who had spent her entire childhood wrestling imaginary bears in the woods, Chloe simply planted her feet, locked her elbows and shoved him. Hard. Julian's eyes widened in comical shock. His arms flailed as he lost his balance, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the polished floor. He tipped backward, hovering in the air for one glorious, suspended second, before crashing straight into the refreshment table. Splash. The grand hall fell dead silent. The music seemed to skip a beat. Julian sat up, sputtering. He was submerged waist-deep in the crystal punch bowl, his crisp white tuxedo shirt completely soaked in neon red fruit punch. A rogue slice of pineapple was resting on his left shoulder. Chloe stood over him, smoothing down her ruffled skirt with terrifying calmness. She picked up a plastic cup, dipped it into the punch right next to his elbow, and took a polite sip. You're right, she said sweetly, looking down at his horrified face. The dress does make me feel more civilized. Chapter 3. The estate was entirely too quiet. When Chloe turned 13, the patriarch decreed that it was time for Julian and Adrian, now 15, to attend St. Jude's Academy, an elite, ivy-draped boarding school located 3 states away. The departure was swift. One day, the estate was filled with the sound of Julian barking orders at the gardeners and Adrian quietly practicing the cello. The next, there was nothing but the rustle of the oak trees and the distant hum of the lawnmowers. At first, Chloe celebrated. She climbed the highest trees without Julian threatening to call security. She ate powdered raspberry tarts without having to trade insults for them. It was paradise. It was also, she fiercely denied to herself, incredibly boring. The first letter arrived in late October. It was not a text message or an email, but a physical cream-colored envelope made of painfully thick paper, sealed with actual red wax. Chloe's father handed it to her over breakfast with a look of deep suspicion. Chloe retreated to the solarium, broke the pretentious wax seal, and unfolded the heavy parchment. Dear Chloe, I am writing to you because Adrian insisted, though I assured him you likely haven't learned how to read cursive yet. St. Jude's is exceptional. The architecture is Gothic revival, the professors are leading experts in their fields, and the student body is suitably refined. Nobody here wears cargo pants or throws shoes at stray animals. It is remarkably peaceful. I am currently at the top of my advanced geometry class. Try not to let your brain atrophy while we are away. Try reading a book without pictures. Regards, Julian. Chloe stared at the letter. Her eye twitched. She immediately marched to her father's study, stole his most expensive fountain pen, and grabbed a piece of completely ordinary, ruled notebook paper. Dear Julian, your handwriting looks like a spider fell into an inkwell and had a seizure on the page, but I managed to decipher it. Congratulations on discovering buildings. I'm sure Gothic revival is very exciting for someone whose personality is also stuck in the 12th century. Since you are a self-proclaimed geometry genius, I've included a proof at the bottom of this page regarding the intersection of altitudes in a triangle. If you can't solve it, don't bother writing back. I'll just assume you're too busy enjoying the peace of not having me around to keep you sharp. P.S. I found where you hid your emergency stash of European chocolates. They were delicious. Chloe. She shoved the letter into an envelope, slapped a stamp on it, and handed it to the postman that afternoon. She expected that to be the end of it. Julian would be too proud to admit he couldn't solve the proof, or too annoyed to reply. 10 days later, another thick, cream-colored envelope arrived. Dear Chloe, your proof was rudimentary. I solved it in 4 minutes between fencing practice and debate club. I have enclosed the correct solution, along with 3 actual, complex algebraic equations that will likely make your head spin. Consider it a charitable donation to your education. Also, those chocolates were imported from Switzerland. You are a monster. Julian. And just like that, the war resumed, fought entirely via the International Postal Service. Over the next 2 years, the letters flew back and forth with furious regularity. They never explicitly admitted they missed each other. Instead, their correspondence was a barrage of heavily disguised academic bragging, scathing insults, and increasingly difficult math puzzles. When Chloe won her school's science fair, she mailed him a copy of her certificate with a sticky note that just said, "Weep." Julian retaliated by sending her a photograph of his pristine report card, framed in cheap plastic, with a note reading, "A visual aid of what excellence looks like." They insulted each other's handwriting, criticized each other's extracurricular choices, and ruthlessly mocked any hint of failure. But hidden beneath the sarcasm was a bizarre lifeline. Julian was the only person who matched Chloe's sharp intellect, and Chloe was the only person who never treated Julian like the untouchable heir to a billionaire empire. To the rest of the world, Julian was becoming a cold, polished prodigy. But in those letters, heavily creased and hidden in a shoebox under Chloe's bed, he was still just the annoying boy who had been pushed into a punch bowl. And as Chloe's 15th birthday approached, marking the twins' impending return for summer holiday, she found herself staring at the driveway far more often than she cared to admit, waiting for a silver luxury car to break the silence. Chapter 4. The Silvertown car crunched over the gravel driveway just after noon on a sweltering Tuesday. For the first time in 2 years, the estate felt like it had woken up. Up in the mansion's sprawling, sunlit library, 15-year-old Chloe didn't rush to the window. Instead, she stayed cross-legged in an oversized leather armchair, her laptop balanced on her knees, her eyes tracking a dense block of Python code she had been debugging for the last hour. She was older now, having traded her beloved cargo pants for sleek dark denim, and her scraped knees for a sharp, cynical wit. She still refused to wear pastels, but the wild, feral energy of her childhood had condensed into something much more focused and infinitely more dangerous. Sheer, unadulterated intellect. Downstairs, the heavy oak doors opened. Footsteps echoed in the grand foyer. 10 minutes later, the library door swung open. Julian stepped inside, pausing on the threshold. At 17, he had lost the last traces of his boyhood awkwardness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a crisp navy button-down that looked like it belonged on a young executive rather than a high school junior. He scanned the room, his eyes sweeping past the antique globes and mahogany shelves until they landed on the armchair. "I assumed I'd have to send the groundskeeper into the oak trees to find you," Julian said, his voice deeper than she remembered, though it still carried that familiar, arrogant drawl. Chloe didn't look up from her screen. "The oak tree has terrible Wi-Fi, and unlike you, I actually have work to do." Julian scoffed, stepping further into the room. He walked over to her chair, looking down at her screen expecting to see a video game or a mindless blog. His eyes narrowed as he took in the lines of code, and the complex back-end data structures parsing on the terminal. "What is this?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "A custom data aggregation script," Chloe replied dryly, finally hitting execute. The terminal flooded with perfect, error-free green text. She snapped the laptop shut and finally looked up at him. "I got bored with the geometry puzzles you kept sending. They were getting repetitive." Julian stared at her. He seemed to realize all at once that the girl sitting in front of him was not the muddy, shoe-throwing menace he had left behind 2 years ago. She was looking back at him with cool, calculating eyes, entirely unimpressed by his height, his expensive clothes, or his boarding school pedigree. "You missed a semicolon on line 42, Julian bluffed, crossing his arms and leaning back, trying to regain his footing. "It's Python, Julian," Chloe said, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her face. "We don't use semicolons to terminate lines. Try to keep up." Julian's jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely thrown off balance. It was a look Chloe found immensely satisfying. "I see your manners haven't improved," Julian recovered, giving her a haughty once-over. "Though I suppose it's a small victory that you aren't currently covered in dirt. Give it time." The summer is young, Chloe retorted, standing up. To Julian's visible dismay, she had grown quite a bit too. She wasn't as tall as him, but she no longer had to crane her neck to glare him in the eye. Adrian walked into the library just then, looking equally polished but carrying a much warmer smile. Chloe, you're indoors. And you haven't punched him yet. This is a new record. Give me 5 minutes, Chloe deadpanned, though she gave Adrian a brief, friendly nod. Julian was still staring at her laptop, his brow furrowed. Who taught you back-end engineering? I taught myself, Chloe said, sliding the laptop into her messenger bag. She slung it over her shoulder and stepped right into his personal space, forcing him to look down at her. So, if you're planning on treating me like an annoying little kid this summer, I suggest you rethink your strategy. Because I'm smarter than you now, Julian. And we both know it. She didn't wait for his response. Chloe walked past him, her shoulder lightly brushing his, and strode out of the library. Julian stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. His heart was doing something strange, and entirely illogical against his ribs. He had spent 2 years sharpening his mind at the best academy in the country, assuming he would return to find Chloe exactly as he left her, a minor, chaotic nuisance. Instead, he realized with a sinking, terrifying thrill, he had just walked into a completely different kind of war. And this time he wasn't sure he was going to win. Chapter 5. Chloe turned 16 with very little fanfare, which was exactly how she liked it. She spent the morning successfully compiling a new machine learning algorithm, and the afternoon avoiding the estate's annual midsummer garden party. Unfortunately, avoiding the party entirely was impossible when her father was the one running it. By 4 p.m., she was forced into a surprisingly tolerable emerald green sundress. She had successfully negotiated her way out of floral prints, and banished to the main lawn to mingle. She immediately found the most secluded stone bench near the rose garden, sat down, and pulled out her phone to read a PDF on advanced calculus. She was halfway through a fascinating theorem on limits when a shadow fell over her screen. Hey, a voice said. Chloe looked up. Standing in front of her was Liam, the son of one of the local country club board members. He was 17, possessed a heavily gelled swoop of blonde hair, and was currently flashing a smile that he clearly practiced in the mirror. Hi, Chloe said flatly, dropping her eyes back to her phone. You're Chloe, right? Your dad works for the boss, Liam said, leaning against the nearest stone trellis in an attempt to look casual. I've seen you around. You don't usually talk to a lot of people at these things. Astute observation, Chloe muttered. I was just thinking, Liam continued, entirely missing her utter lack of interest. Maybe you and I could get out of here? Grab a coffee or something. There's a place down the road. 50 yards away, standing near the champagne fountain, 18-year-old Julian stopped mid-sentence. He had been politely nodding along to a wealthy investor's monologue about golf, but his eyes were currently locked onto the rose garden. A sudden, intensely irrational spike of irritation shot through his chest. He didn't know who that guy with the terrible hair was, but he was standing entirely too close to Chloe. Before his brain could process why he cared, Julian was moving. Excuse me, Julian said smoothly, cutting off the investor. A matter of estate security requires my attention. He strode across the lawn with purpose, his perfectly tailored linen suit cutting a sharp silhouette. As he approached the bench, he caught the end of Liam's pitch. So, what do you say? Just you and me? Liam was asking, leaning in closer. Liam, isn't it? Julian's voice cut through the air like a silver knife. Liam jumped, spinning around to face the heir of the estate. Oh, Julian. Sir. Hey. I was just talking to Chloe. I see that, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He stepped between them, smoothly blocking Liam's view of Chloe. He draped an arm over Liam's shoulder, turning him slightly away. Liam, my friend. May I offer you a piece of vital advice regarding your continued health and safety? Liam blinked, thoroughly confused. Sure. Julian leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a grave, confidential whisper. You don't want to do that. You seem like a nice guy with intact bone structure. I'd hate to see it ruined. Ruined? Liam squeaked. She looks quiet, doesn't she? Julian murmured, nodding solemnly toward where Chloe was sitting, entirely oblivious to this conversation. A quiet girl reading on a bench. But let me assure you, she is completely feral. Has she mentioned her underground Muay Thai training? Her what? She has a black belt in Krav Maga. Julian continued without missing a beat, his expression a mask of grim sincerity. She shattered a man's femur last Tuesday because he breathed too loudly while she was coding. She has a registered weapon for a left hook. If you take her for coffee and get her order wrong, they will never find your body, Liam. Liam turned pale. He looked past Julian's shoulder at Chloe, who at that exact moment violently swatted a bee away from her face with a terrifyingly fast reflex. Liam swallowed hard. I think my mom is looking for me. A wise choice, Julian said, patting Liam on the shoulder. Run along. Liam didn't walk. He practically sprinted across the lawn toward the safety of the buffet tables. Julian straightened his jacket, deeply satisfied, and turned back around to find Chloe standing there, her hands on her hips, watching Liam flee as if he were being chased by wolves. Why? Chloe asked slowly. Did that boy just look at me like I am the Grim Reaper and sprint toward the hedge maze? Julian smoothed his lapels, looking entirely unbothered. He suddenly remembered a pressing engagement. Julian, what did you say to him? She demanded, narrowing her eyes. I simply reminded him of his place. Julian lied smoothly, though a faint, treacherous heat was rising in his neck. He looked at her in the emerald dress, realizing with a jolt that it matched her sharp eyes perfectly. And I protected the estate from a massive liability. A liability? If you had gone on a date with him, you undoubtedly would have grown bored within 5 minutes and pushed him into a fountain, Julian said, crossing his arms. I am simply saving the groundskeepers from having to fish him out. Chloe stared at him for a long, calculating moment. She took a step closer. You're lying. I am the picture of honesty. You sabotaged me, she accused, though the corner of her mouth twitched upward. I did you a favor, Julian countered, leaning down slightly so they were eye to eye. The boy uses store-bought hair gel, Chloe. Have some standards. Before she could form a sufficiently scathing reply, Julian turned and strolled back toward the party, leaving Chloe staring after him, thoroughly bewildered, and secretly, infuriatingly amused. Chapter 6. The transition from high school to university was, for Chloe, less of a step up and more of a victory sprint. At 18, she enrolled in a dual-degree program at a top-tier technical institute, double majoring in applied mathematics and computer science. She traded the sprawling, quiet grounds of the estate for the chaotic, caffeinated energy of a university campus. Her days were a blur of differential equations, complex classification models, and late-night coding sessions fueled entirely by vending machine coffee and sheer willpower. 2 states away, 20-year-old Julian was in his junior year at a prestigious Ivy League university, carefully being molded into the heir apparent of his father's corporate empire. His schedule was filled with macroeconomics, corporate law, and networking galas. Logically, their paths should have diverged entirely. Illogically, Julian was currently ignoring a 20-page thesis on international trade regulations to stare intensely at a live collegiate hackathon leaderboard on his third monitor. You're doing it again, Adrian noted mildly, walking into Julian's meticulously clean off-campus apartment holding 2 cups of coffee. Doing what? Julian asked, not blinking. He tapped a pen rhythmically against his mahogany desk. Stalking, Adrian replied, setting a cup down near Julian's keyboard. He leaned over, glancing at the screen. The screen displayed a nationwide, 48-hour competitive coding bracket. Currently, sitting in the number 1 spot with a staggering lead in points, was a team called Syntax Errors. The team captain was listed as C. Palmer. I am not stalking, Julian said, his tone dripping with aristocratic dignity. I am monitoring collegiate talent. As the future head of a major tech-integrated conglomerate, it is my fiduciary duty to keep an eye on emerging prodigies. It's corporate scouting. She's an 18-year-old freshman, Julian. You're scouting a freshman? She developed an algorithmic model for parsing singular points in differential equations that operates 12% faster than the industry standard. Julian snapped defensively, turning his chair to face his brother. And she did it between her Tuesday classes. It's highly relevant. Adrian took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Right. Corporate scouting. That explains why you looked like you wanted to commit a felony when you saw she was grouped with 3 male upperclassmen for the project. I am concerned about intellectual property theft, Julian deadpanned, turning back to the screen. Upperclassmen are notorious for stealing credit from underclassmen. You haven't seen her in 6 months, Adrian pointed out softly. Julian's hand froze over his mouse. It was true. Between their respective heavy course loads, they hadn't crossed paths since Christmas break. In the past, Julian would have enjoyed the peace and quiet. He would have relished the lack of sarcastic remarks and the complete absence of muddy sneakers in the estate halls. But sitting in his quiet, expensive apartment, Staring at her name in glowing digital text, Julian felt a sudden, hollow ache in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate scouting or academic rivalry. He missed her. He missed the sharp, wicked spark in her eyes when she successfully outsmarted him. He missed the way she completely disregarded his wealth and status, treating him not as a future billionaire, but as an irritating, worthy opponent. He watched the leaderboard refresh. Syntax errors had just submitted their final build. The score ticked up. They had won. Before he could stop himself, Julian picked up his phone and opened his messages. Julian, 11:42 p.m. I see your little coding club managed to win the regional bracket. Congratulations on beating a bunch of sleep-deprived sophomores. The response came through less than 30 seconds later. Chloe, 11:43 p.m. Are you stalking my hackathon leaderboard, Julian? Don't you have a terribly boring economics paper to write? Julian, 11:44 p.m. I am scouting potential entry-level hires. You barely made the cut. Chloe, 11:45 p.m. Keep dreaming. By the time I graduate, you'll be working for me. Julian stared at the text. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, entirely erasing the tense corporate mask he wore all day. He locked his phone and tossed it onto the desk. Adrian watched the entire exchange from the doorway, shaking his head in fond exasperation. You are completely doomed, you know that, right? I have no idea what you're talking about. Julian lied effortlessly, turning back to his economics thesis with sudden, renewed energy. But as he typed, his eyes kept darting back to the third monitor, making sure her name was still sitting firmly at the top. Chapter 7. The Vanguard conglomerate headquarters was a towering monolith of glass, steel, and intimidating corporate silence located in the heart of the financial district. For 19-year-old Chloe, landing a summer internship in their elite data systems division was a massive achievement. It was purely on merit. She had applied under her mother's maiden name to ensure her father's position at the estate didn't influence the hiring committee. She walked out of the elevator on the 42nd floor on her first Monday, wearing a sharp, minimalist charcoal blazer and trousers. She felt like a capable, independent adult ready to conquer the tech industry. That feeling lasted for exactly 3 minutes. Ah, the new intern, a crisp, terribly familiar voice echoed across the open-plan floor. Chloe froze. She slowly turned around. Standing by the glass-walled conference room, holding a tablet and flanked by 2 nervous-looking junior analysts, was Julian. He was 21 now, fresh out of his accelerated degree program, and wearing a tailored slate gray suit that screamed junior executive with too much power. Julian, Chloe said, her voice flat. What are you doing here? I work here, Julian replied smoothly, stepping away from the analysts and walking toward her. I am the new director of special projects for the data systems division, which means, incidentally, I am your direct supervisor. Chloe blinked. She looked at the 2 analysts, who were staring at the floor, and then back at Julian. You're my boss. I am, Julian said, his lips twitching into a smug, victorious little smile. Welcome to Vanguard, Chloe. I expect your coffee-fetching skills are up to corporate standards. Chloe let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. If you think I'm fetching you coffee, Julian, you have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my presence here, my technical capabilities, and my willingness to pour hot liquids on expensive suits. The 2 junior analysts gasped in unison. The entire bullpen of the 42nd floor suddenly went dead silent. Nobody spoke to the patriarch's son like that, especially not a 19-year-old summer intern on her first day. Julian didn't look angry. If anything, his eyes gleamed with absolute delight. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Careful, Miss Palmer. That sounds like insubordination. It sounds like a factual observation. Chloe fired back, not backing down an inch. I was hired to restructure the legacy database, not cater to your caffeine addiction. Fine, Julian conceded, straightening his tie. I expect a full preliminary diagnostic of the legacy servers on my desk by 4 p.m. If it's not up to my standards, I will send it back. I'll have it done by 2 p.m., Chloe challenged, her chin tilting up. 1 p.m., Julian countered. Noon. And it will be flawless. We shall see, Julian murmured. He turned on his heel to walk back to his massive corner office. He paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. Oh, and Chloe? The dress code requires proper footwear. No cargo pants, no sneakers. Though I do miss the combat boots, they terrify the shareholders. He shut the glass door behind him. The entire office was staring at Chloe as if she were a ghost, or perhaps a live grenade. A senior developer cautiously rolled his chair over to her desk. Are you out of your mind? He whispered frantically. That's the air. He fired a guy last week for formatting an Excel sheet incorrectly. He's terrifying. He's not terrifying, Chloe scoffed, dropping her messenger bag onto her desk and firing up her dual monitors. He's a glorified hall monitor with a superiority complex and a fear of stray dogs. Over the next 4 weeks, the 42nd floor became the stage for the most entertaining, high-stakes workplace tension in the history of Vanguard conglomerate. Julian treated the internship as an extension of their lifelong war. He buried her in complex algorithmic puzzles disguised as urgent corporate tasks. He scheduled progress check-ins, just to critique her syntax and hover behind her chair, smelling infuriatingly of that expensive pine needle cologne. Chloe, in turn, ruthlessly optimized every system she touched, completing his impossible tasks in half the time just to watch his jaw tighten in frustration. She left heavily encrypted sticky notes on his desk mocking his reliance on outdated macroeconomics models. The staff watched in a state of constant whiplash. They couldn't figure out if the director of special projects and the prodigy in turn despised each other, or were communicating on a plane of existence no one else understood. The climax of the month occurred during a massive board presentation. A bug in the presentation software caused the quarterly projection graphs to crash in front of 20 senior partners. Julian, standing at the podium, maintained his icy composure, but the tech team was panicking. From the back of the room, Chloe didn't panic. She quietly opened her laptop, bypassed the presentation's firewall with terrifying speed, rewrote a corrupted line of code on the live server, and pushed the update. The graphs flashed back onto the screen, perfectly functional, less than 40 seconds after they crashed. Julian paused his speech. He looked across the boardroom, over the heads of the senior partners, straight at the back row. Chloe met his gaze, raised one eyebrow, and gave him a slow, incredibly sarcastic salute. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the terrifying junior executive slipped. Julian smiled. A real, unshielded, breathtaking smile that made the senior partners blink in confusion. As you can see, Julian continued smoothly, his eyes still locked on Chloe, Vanguard systems are highly resilient. And our talent is unparalleled. Sitting in the back row, Chloe felt a sudden, dangerous flutter in her stomach. She snapped her laptop shut, realizing with dawning horror that the line between wanting to strangle Julian and wanting to impress him was getting dangerously, uncomfortably thin. Chapter 8. The Vanguard Winter Solstice Gala was the crown jewel of the estate's social calendar. It was a massive, glittering affair where billionaires, politicians, and tech moguls gathered to drink excessively expensive champagne and pretend they liked each other. For Chloe's father, it was the most stressful night of the year. He was running the logistics, which meant he was currently pacing the perimeter of the grand ballroom with an earpiece, looking as though he were ready to order a tactical strike on the catering staff. Because of his sheer panic, 20-year-old Chloe had agreed to attend, mostly just to stand near him and occasionally hand him a glass of water. I am expecting a disaster, her father muttered as Chloe met him near the grand staircase. The floral arrangements in the west wing are 2 degrees off-center. It's anarchy. Nobody is looking at the flowers, Dad, Chloe assured him. Her father stopped pacing, finally looking at her. He blinked, clearly taken aback. You look civilized, Chloe supplied dryly. I was going to say beautiful, he corrected softly. Chloe felt a rare flush of embarrassment. She had firmly rejected the frothy, pastel nightmares of her middle school years. Tonight, she wore a floor-length, minimalist silk gown in a deep, striking midnight blue. It had a sharp asymmetric neckline, an open back, and absolutely zero ruffles. Her hair was swept up into a sleek twist, save for a few loose strands framing her face. She looked like a blade, elegant, sharp and dangerous. Don't get used to it, Chloe warned, adjusting a silver cuff on her wrist. Underneath this silk, I am still heavily armed with sarcasm and a strong desire to go home and debug my neural network. Across the ballroom, 22-year-old Julian was doing what he did best, holding court. He was surrounded by a circle of wealthy investors, looking devastatingly handsome in a bespoke black tuxedo. He was nodding politely to a tedious story about a yacht, projecting the image of the perfect, untouchable corporate heir. Adrian, standing slightly behind him, was the first to notice. Adrian tapped Julian's shoulder, leaned in and murmured, "Brace yourself. 3 o'clock." Julian casually turned his head, expecting to see a rival CEO or a minor politician. Instead, he saw Chloe. She was standing near the staircase, laughing at something her father had said. The crystal chandeliers caught the sheen of her midnight blue dress, the silk wrapping perfectly around her frame. She looked entirely self-assured, radiating a kind of quiet, brilliant power that made the rest of the glittering room look incredibly dull. Julian's brain fundamentally stopped working. The investor in front of him finished his yacht story and paused, waiting for a response. Julian said absolutely nothing. He just stared, the champagne glass in his hand frozen midway to his mouth. Julian, the investor prompted. Adrian smoothly stepped in. Fascinating point about the maritime tax codes, Richard. If you'll excuse us, Julian needs to review the charitable donations. Adrian grabbed Julian by the elbow and physically rotated him away from the circle. Breathe, brother, Adrian whispered, highly amused. You look like you just got hit by a truck. Julian started, his voice completely failing him. He cleared his throat, desperately trying to reboot his cognitive functions. She's wearing a dress. Very observant. A stunning one too, Adrian noted. Are you going to go say hello, or are you going to stand here and stare until you spontaneously combust? Julian straightened his tuxedo jacket, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. He had spent the last 10 years trading barbs with Chloe, competing with her, and treating her like an intellectual sparring partner. But as he walked across the ballroom toward her, every single defense mechanism he possessed evaporated. Chloe saw him approaching and automatically braced for a sarcastic comment. She tilted her chin up, ready to fire back. But when Julian stopped in front of her, the sarcasm didn't come. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her throat, the sharp cut of the silk gown, and the familiar, intelligent spark in her eyes. The usual arrogant smirk was completely absent from his face. He looked entirely, deeply wrecked. Julian. Chloe prompted when the silence stretched for an uncomfortably long 5 seconds. Did the Wi-Fi crash? Are you rebooting? Julian managed to say. His voice was slightly hoarse. He cleared it again. You look. He stopped. The heir to the Vanguard Empire, a man who could negotiate multi-million-dollar acquisitions without blinking, had completely lost his vocabulary. Chloe's heart did a sudden, violent flip against her ribs. The way he was looking at her, like she was the only fixed point in a spinning room, sent a rush of heat straight to her face. She suddenly felt very conscious of the open back of her dress, and the way his eyes lingered on her. I look what? She challenged softly, her voice losing its usual sharp edge. Julian swallowed hard. He stepped half an inch closer, the scent of his pine needle cologne wrapping around her. You look dangerous, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. Before Chloe could process that, before she could come up with a clever retort to hide the sudden flutter in her chest, her father's voice crackled frantically from his earpiece, and he hurried over. Julian, thank goodness. The ice sculpture in the east wing is melting onto the velvet drapes. I need authorization to move it. The spell snapped. Julian blinked, physically tearing his eyes away from Chloe to look at her father. Right. Yes. Move it to the terrace. When Julian looked back, Chloe was already turning to follow her father, her midnight blue dress sweeping across the marble floor. She glanced over her shoulder just once, and gave Julian a tiny, unreadable smile. Julian stood frozen by the staircase for another 10 minutes, absolutely terrified of the realization hitting him. He wasn't just attracted to her. He was completely, irreversibly in love with the girl who used to throw shoes at stray dogs. Chapter 9. A year after the Winter Solstice Gala, the fragile competitive dynamic between Chloe and Julian had shifted into something highly volatile. They were no longer just trading sarcastic remarks. Every interaction crackled with an unspoken, heavy tension that left them both exhausted. At 21, Chloe was in her senior year and leading a prestigious university team. At 23, Julian was officially the youngest senior director at Vanguard. Logically, they had no reason to interact. Until Vanguard announced the Academic Corporate Synergy Initiative, a massive grant program designed to integrate top-tier university projects into live corporate servers. You orchestrated this, Chloe accused, slamming a massive binder onto the glass conference table on the 42nd floor of Vanguard HQ. Julian, sitting at the head of the table in a flawlessly pressed dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, didn't even blink. I have no idea what you mean. The board selected your predictive data model because it showed promise. The board selected it because the corporate liaison specifically requested it, Chloe countered, narrowing her eyes. And you are the corporate liaison. I am deeply committed to educational outreach, Julian replied, his voice a smooth, impenetrable drawl. Now sit down, Palmer. We have to integrate your messy academic code into my pristine corporate architecture by Friday, and you are currently wasting time. That was the beginning of the most grueling 72 hours of Chloe's life. The integration project required them to be locked in the primary systems lab for 3 days straight. By 3:14 a.m. on the third night, the lab looked like the site of a chaotic intellectual war. The glass whiteboards were covered in a frenzied mix of black and red dry erase markers. Empty takeout containers were stacked precariously in the corner. Chloe was sitting cross-legged in a swivel chair, wearing an oversized university hoodie, her hair piled into a messy bun held together by 2 pencils. Julian was pacing the length of the lab, his tie discarded hours ago, his hair uncharacteristically ruffled as he stared at a wall of scrolling data. Your recursive loop is a memory leak waiting to happen, Julian argued, pointing a red marker at the board. If we scale this to Vanguard's active user base, the servers will choke by Tuesday. It's not a memory leak, it's an elegant fail-safe, Chloe shot back, spinning her chair around. If you understood dynamic programming instead of just relying on brute force processing power, you would see that. I am protecting a billion-dollar infrastructure from a college student's experimental pet project. My pet project is currently operating at 94% efficiency while your infrastructure keeps throwing syntax errors. They glared at each other across the room. The hum of the servers the only sound breaking the heavy, sleep-deprived silence. Coffee, they both declared at the exact same time. They turned and speed-walked toward the small break room attached to the lab. Chloe was faster, but Julian had longer legs. They arrived at the coffee machine in a dead heat. Chloe looked at the glass pot. There was exactly 1 cup of dark, sludgy coffee left. I am the lead engineer on this integration, Chloe said, reaching for the pot. I need the caffeine to fix your terrible back-end logic. I am the senior director funding your existence, Julian countered, his hand snapping out to grab the handle of the pot at the exact same moment her hand did. Their fingers collided. Chloe froze. A sudden, electric shock shot up her arm at the contact. She looked up, ready to deliver a scathing insult about his aggressive coffee hoarding, but the words died in her throat. Julian wasn't glaring at her. He was standing entirely too close, staring down at her with an intensity that completely short-circuited her brain. His dark eyes dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, then back up to her eyes. The air in the tiny break room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The arrogant corporate air was gone. In his place was just a deeply exhausted, 23-year-old man who looked like he wanted to close the remaining distance between them and do something completely reckless. Julian, Chloe whispered, her voice unsteady. Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at her hand, still resting beneath his on the coffee pot handle. He closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second, taking a slow breath. When he opened them, the intense, terrifying vulnerability was carefully locked away, replaced by a soft, almost defeated resignation. He slowly pulled his hand back, letting go of the pot. Take it, he murmured, his voice rough. Chloe blinked, completely thrown off balance. What? No sarcastic comment? No speech about corporate hierarchy? Just take the coffee, Chloe, Julian said softly, stepping back and leaning against the counter, suddenly looking infinitely more tired. You need it more than I do. Your code it's brilliant. I'm just trying to make sure it survives the deployment. Chloe stared at him, the glass pot heavy in her hand. She had prepared for an argument, for a battle of wits, for their usual high-stakes intellectual combat. She had not prepared for him to look at her with such quiet, unguarded respect. It completely undid her. She poured the coffee into 2 mugs, splitting the last cup perfectly down the middle. She handed one to him. Julian looked at the half-full mug, then up at her, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. A compromise? I didn't think you knew the meaning of the word. Don't let it go to your head, Chloe muttered, though she couldn't stop the soft blush creeping up her neck. She took a sip of her coffee and turned back toward the lab, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. Syntax errors, indeed. Chapter 10. At 22, Chloe was officially a full-time lead architect in Vanguard's data systems division. She had her own glass-walled office, a team of slightly terrified junior developers, and a coffee machine that she had personally hot-wired to bypass the corporate brew limits. She also had a completely new, entirely unexpected problem. His name was Marcus. Marcus was a new senior back-end engineer. He was 25, possessed an undeniably symmetrical face, and had the annoying habit of leaning entirely too close whenever they were doing code reviews. I'm just saying, Marcus purred on a Tuesday afternoon, leaning his hip against Chloe's desk and pointing at her monitor. Your algorithmic logic is practically poetry. If you were a function, you'd be a perfect loop. Chloe, who had been staring at the same block of code for 3 hours, blinked slowly. Marcus, that is the worst programming pickup line I have ever heard in my life, and I spent 4 years in a university computer science department. Marcus laughed, clearly unfazed, and leaned a little closer. I can do better. Why don't we grab dinner tonight? We can discuss system architecture over wine. Down the hallway, Julian was walking out of a high-level executive strategy meeting. He was 24, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, and currently reviewing a quarterly earnings report on his tablet. As he passed the data system's bullpen, he glanced through the glass wall of Chloe's office. He stopped dead in his tracks. The earnings report on his tablet was instantly forgotten. Through the glass, he saw Marcus leaning over Chloe's desk, invading her personal space, smiling that infuriatingly charming smile. Julian felt a sudden, violent spike of pure, unadulterated territorial rage. It was the exact same feeling he had when that boy Liam had approached Chloe at the garden party 6 years ago, only magnified by 1,000. He shoved the tablet into the hands of a passing junior analyst, who squeaked in alarm. Sir? The analyst stammered. Hold that, Julian snapped, already moving. He strode across the bullpen, pushed open the glass door to Chloe's office without knocking, and stepped inside. He completely ignored Marcus and looked directly at Chloe. Palmer, Julian said, his voice a sharp, commanding whip that made Marcus jump. I need an immediate review of the firewall protocols on the tertiary servers. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She looked at the clock on her wall. Julian, it's 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. The tertiary servers haven't been active since last month. They don't need a review. They do now, Julian said, smoothly walking around the desk and stepping right between her and Marcus. He effectively walled the other man off using nothing but his height and the sheer force of his presence. There has been a structural vulnerability. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to regain his footing. Mr. Director. Sir. I was actually just going over some system architecture with Chloe. Marcus, isn't it? Julian said, finally turning his head to look at the engineer. His tone was technically polite, but his eyes were completely lethal. Are you currently assigned to the primary database migration? Yes, sir. Then why are you loitering in the lead architect's office offering inadequate coding metaphors when you are 3 days behind on your migration benchmarks? Julian asked softly. Marcus went completely pale. I wasn't. I suggest, Julian murmured, stepping half an inch closer to Marcus. You return to your desk and focus on your loops, before I decide your position here is redundant. Marcus didn't even look at Chloe. He practically scrambled backward out of the office, nearly tripping over the doorframe in his haste to escape the terrifyingly calm wrath of the corporate air. Silence descended on the office. Chloe stared at the empty doorway, then slowly turned her chair to face Julian. He was standing near her desk, adjusting his cuffs, looking deeply satisfied with himself. Did you just threaten to fire a senior engineer because he asked me to dinner? Chloe asked, her voice dangerously quiet. I reminded an employee of his deadlines, Julian corrected smoothly, turning to face her. He was harassing you. He was flirting with me, Julian. There's a difference. Julian's jaw tightened. He placed both hands on her desk and leaned down, his face suddenly inches from hers. The sharp scent of his pine needle cologne flooded her senses. He uses store-bought hair gel, Chloe, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. I told you at 16 to have some standards. I expect better from my lead architect. Maybe my standards have changed, Chloe challenged, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. She refused to lean back, matching his intense gaze. Maybe I want to have dinner with someone who doesn't constantly demand arbitrary server reviews just to hover in my office. I do not hover, Julian denied, though he didn't move an inch away. You are literally hovering right now, Chloe pointed out, her breath catching slightly as his dark eyes flicked down to her lips. The tension in the room snapped tight, a physical, heavy thing pulling between them. For a long, agonizing second, Julian looked like he was going to throw every corporate rule out the window and kiss her right there in the middle of the glass-walled office. Instead, he swallowed hard, abruptly pushing himself away from the desk. Have the firewall report on my desk by 5, Julian said, his voice completely strained. He turned and walked out of the office, his rigid posture doing nothing to hide the fact that he was practically fleeing the room. Chloe sat frozen in her chair, her pulse roaring in her ears, realizing with absolute certainty that this 16-year war was rapidly approaching its breaking point. Chapter 11. The tension from the incident with Marcus did not dissipate. Instead, it festered, turning the 42nd floor of Vanguard headquarters into a hostile, highly volatile war zone for the next 3 days. Julian was impossible. He rejected 2 of Chloe's perfectly sound architectural proposals, demanded unnecessary meetings, and seemed to materialize like a sharply dressed ghost every time a male colleague spoke to her for more than 40 seconds. Chloe was equally infuriating. She deliberately submitted her code in a formatting style she knew he hated, accidentally locked him out of the secondary testing server for an hour, and replaced his expensive espresso beans in the executive lounge with standard-issue decaf. By Friday night, the entire data systems division had fled the building by 5 p.m., terrified of being caught in the crossfire. At 8:30 p.m., Chloe finally packed up her laptop. She was exhausted, her head was pounding, and a massive thunderstorm had just rolled over the city, unleashing a torrential downpour against the glass walls of the building. She took the elevator down to the ground floor lobby, pushed through the revolving doors, and stopped under the massive concrete awning. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. The streets were completely flooded, and getting a cab was going to be a nightmare. Don't even think about walking to the subway in this. Chloe whipped around. Julian was standing a few feet away, holding a sleek black umbrella. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, the top 2 buttons of his collar undone, making him look dangerously undone. He looked just as exhausted as she felt. I can take care of myself, Julian, Chloe snapped, the sheer exhaustion of the week finally fraying her temper. I don't need you to manage my commute on top of managing my entire existence. I am trying to make sure my lead architect doesn't catch pneumonia, Julian retorted, stepping closer. My driver is pulling up. Get in the car. No. Julian paused, clearly thrown. No. It's a monsoon out there, Chloe. I said no, she repeated, turning to face him fully, the anger boiling over. I am so tired of this, Julian. I am tired of you hovering. I am tired of you sabotaging my work just to get a reaction out of me. And I am incredibly tired of you acting like you own me. Julian's eyes darkened. I do not act like I own you. You threatened to fire a senior engineer because he asked me to dinner. Chloe yelled over the sound of the rain, stepping out from beneath the awning. The rain instantly soaked her shoulders, but she didn't care. You review my servers when they don't need reviewing. You stand in my office and look at me like what, Chloe? Julian demanded, his own temper flaring as he stepped out from the awning to follow her, completely ignoring the umbrella in his hand as the rain began to soak his expensive shirt. Tell me how I look at you. Like I'm a puzzle you can't figure out, she shouted, wiping the rain from her eyes. Like I'm still that feral 8-year-old girl you have to keep contained. Well, I'm not. I grew up, Julian. I'm brilliant, I'm capable, and I don't need a babysitter with a superiority complex. You think I see you as a child? Julian yelled back, throwing the umbrella onto the wet concrete. The sound echoed sharply in the plaza. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his chest heaving. Are you actually that blind? Chloe froze, her breath catching in her throat as he towered over her in the pouring rain. I haven't looked at you like that in years, Julian said, his voice dropping to a rough, desperate gravel that cut straight through the noise of the storm. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders, pulling her an inch closer. I look at you and I lose my mind. I see you talking to some idiot with bad hair, and I want to tear the building down. I look at your code and I want to give you the entire company. Chloe stared up at him, completely paralyzed. The rain was plastering his dark hair to his forehead, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. You make me absolutely crazy, Chloe, Julian confessed, his voice breaking on her name. He slid his hands from her shoulders up to her neck, his thumbs tracing her jawline with a heartbreakingly tender reverence. You are the smartest, most terrifying, most beautiful woman I have ever met, and I have been entirely, hopelessly in love with you since you wore that blue dress. Chloe's heart completely stopped. The entire world narrowed down to the space between them, the heat of his hands on her skin, and the raw, unshielded truth in his eyes. You, Chloe started, her voice barely a whisper against the rain. You threw a punch bowl at me once. A choked, breathless laugh escaped Julian's lips. You pushed me in first. I was going to do it again, she breathed. Do it, Julian murmured, stepping into her space, entirely eliminating the distance between them. Throw anything you want at me. Just don't ask me to stop looking at you. Chloe didn't throw anything. Instead, she reached up, grabbed the soaked lapels of his shirt, and pulled him down. When his lips crashed against hers, it was 16 years of suppressed rivalry, unspoken tension, and desperate longing finally breaking wide open. Julian groaned, wrapping his arms securely around her waist and lifting her slightly off the ground, kissing her back with a fierce, possessive hunger that stole the breath right out of her lungs. It was chaotic, wet, and absolutely perfect. Chloe tangled her hands in his hair, pulling him closer, kissing him until the cold rain, the corporate architecture, and the rest of the world completely faded away. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Julian rested his forehead against hers. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive shirt ruined, but he was smiling a brilliant, devastating smile. "I win," he whispered into the rain. Chloe laughed, a bright, genuine sound, and tightened her grip on his shirt. "Keep dreaming, corporate boy. I'm just letting you think you have the upper hand." Chapter 12. Transitioning from lifelong, bitter rivals to romantic partners should have been a graceful evolution. For Chloe and Julian, it was a logistical nightmare. The primary issue was their fathers. If the patriarch found out his heir was dating his chief advisor's daughter, he would immediately turn it into a heavily publicized corporate merger. If Chloe's father found out, he would likely have a stress-induced aneurysm about professional boundaries and estate protocol. So they decided to keep it a secret, which meant that publicly, they had to maintain the illusion that they still wanted to dropkick each other into the sun. "You are a menace to my productivity," Julian announced loudly on a Thursday afternoon, storming into the data system's bullpen. He slammed a folder onto Chloe's desk. "This timeline is completely unacceptable, Palmer." The junior analysts in the room immediately hunched over their keyboards, trying to make themselves invisible. Chloe stood up, slamming her hands onto her desk. "The timeline is perfectly accurate, Julian. If you weren't constantly bottlenecking the approval process with your microscopic need for control, we would be ahead of schedule. My need for control is what keeps this division from spiraling into anarchy. Your need for control is a massive psychological flaw." They glared at each other, chest to chest, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "My office." Now, Julian snarled. "Gladly," Chloe snapped back. She marched past him, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor, and swept into his glass-walled office. Julian followed, slamming the door shut behind them and sharply twisting the lock. He immediately hit a button on his desk that frosted the smart glass walls, turning the transparent office completely opaque. The second the glass frosted over, the furious scowls vanished from both of their faces. Julian dropped his clipboard, grabbed Chloe by the waist, and backed her up against the heavy oak door, kissing her with a desperate, breathless intensity. Chloe laughed into his mouth, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. "You were overacting," Chloe whispered when they finally broke apart, resting her forehead against his chin. Calling it a psychological flaw was a bit much. The analysts looked like they were going to cry. "I am a very convincing actor," Julian murmured, burying his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her vanilla shampoo. "And you called me a bottleneck. I had to defend my honor. Besides, it was the only way I could get you in here without raising suspicion." "We are going to get caught," Chloe warned, though she made zero effort to push him away. "Never," Julian promised, kissing her jaw. "I am a master of corporate espionage." His claim was put to the ultimate test 3 days later at the estate. It was a Sunday evening, and Chloe was supposed to be in her father's wing of the house reading. Instead, she was currently sitting on the floor of the main estate's massive library, leaning back against Julian's chest between two towering shelves of 17th-century literature. They were sharing a box of smuggled raspberry tarts, entirely hidden from the main walkway. Julian was softly tracing the line of her collarbone, murmuring something highly distracting about her latest algorithmic model, when the heavy library doors creaked open. "Julian? Are you in here?" Chloe completely froze. It was Chloe's father. Julian's eyes went wide. He instantly clamped a hand over Chloe's mouth to stop her from gasping. He shoved the box of raspberry tarts behind a stack of encyclopedias and desperately tried to calculate their escape route. There was none. They were trapped in the history section. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, growing closer. "Julian," her father called out again, his voice echoing. "Your father needs to review the quarterly projections. And I cannot find Chloe anywhere. I swear, that girl still climbs out of windows just to spite me." Julian slowly, carefully shifted his weight, pulling Chloe flush against his side, so they were completely obscured by a heavy mahogany rolling ladder. He held his breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against Chloe's shoulder. The footsteps paused right at the edge of their aisle. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable shout of shock and the subsequent aneurysm. Empty, her father muttered to himself. The footsteps retreated. The heavy library doors clicked shut. Chloe and Julian remained frozen for a full 60 seconds, listening to the absolute silence of the room. Finally, Julian let out a long, shuddering exhale and dropped his head back against the bookshelf. Master of corporate espionage, Chloe whispered, pulling his hand away from her mouth. Her voice was shaking with suppressed laughter. We were almost murdered in the history section. That was a calculated tactical retreat, Julian argued, though his pulse was still racing. He looked down at her, the sheer absurdity of the situation catching up to him. A reluctant, breathless laugh escaped his chest. We cannot keep doing this. I am 23 years old. I cannot hide behind a ladder from my chief of staff. It adds an element of danger, Chloe teased, turning in his arms to face him. She reached up to fix his slightly rumpled collar. Admit it. You love the adrenaline. I love you, Julian corrected softly, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. The absolute sincerity in his eyes made the teasing smile melt off her face. But if your father catches us, he is going to revoke my access to the oak trees. And I've grown quite fond of them. We'll tell them, Chloe promised, leaning in to steal a soft, lingering kiss. Eventually, when we figure out how to do it without causing a global diplomatic crisis. Deal, Julian murmured. But until then, we need a better hiding spot. I hear the server room on the 42nd floor is highly secure. Chapter 13. The secrecy lasted exactly 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. It did not end with a dramatic corporate leak, a misplaced email, or a scandalous photo. It ended on a completely ordinary Sunday afternoon in the exact place it all began. The main estate courtyard. It was a quiet weekend. Adrian was out of town, and the estate staff were mostly on rotation. Chloe and Julian had spent the morning genuinely working, arguing over a massive server migration for Vanguard, before deciding they needed fresh air. They were sitting on the stone edge of the central fountain. The manicured hedges and pastel flower beds looked exactly as they had when Chloe was 8. Currently, Julian was sitting behind her, his long legs framing hers, his chin resting comfortably on her shoulder as they looked at the water. Chloe was leaning back against his chest, her eyes closed, completely relaxed as his fingers lightly traced soothing circles on her waist. I still think we should move the server launch to Thursday, Julian murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the side of her neck. If you launch on Thursday, you run straight into the fiscal quarterly update traffic, Chloe replied lazily, tilting her head to give him better access. Move it to Saturday night. 3 a.m. Less traffic, fewer executives awake to panic if something stutters. You're brilliant, you know that? I am acutely aware. Julian chuckled, his breath warm against her skin. He turned her slightly, intending to kiss her properly, completely forgetting they were out in the open. Well, it certainly took you too long enough. The voice was dry, impeccably calm, and echoed loudly across the courtyard stones. Chloe and Julian scrambled apart like they had been hit by a live wire. Julian nearly fell backward into the fountain, while Chloe shot to her feet, her heart leaping straight into her throat. Standing on the terrace, holding a cup of Earl Grey tea, was Chloe's father. Standing right next to him, looking deeply amused, was the billionaire patriarch of the Vanguard Empire, Julian's father. Chloe felt the blood completely drain from her face. This was it. The apocalypse. Her father was going to have a heart attack, the patriarch was going to fire her, and she was going to have to move to a remote island to escape the fallout. Julian, recovering his balance, immediately stepped in front of Chloe. The instinct was purely protective, his corporate mask slamming into place. Father. Sir, Julian started, his voice steady despite the absolute panic in his eyes. I can explain. This is entirely my doing, and Chloe's position at Vanguard should not be. Oh, relax, Julian, the patriarch interrupted, taking a sip of his tea. He sounded utterly unbothered. No one is firing anyone. You're giving me a headache with all that posturing. Chloe cautiously peeked out from behind Julian's shoulder. Dad? Are you having a medical emergency? Her father didn't look angry. He didn't look stressed. Instead, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his impeccably tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. He flipped it open to a heavily creased page. Medical emergency? Nonsense, her father said, looking down at the notebook. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and made a slow, deliberate checkmark on the page. I am experiencing the profound satisfaction of a perfectly executed, 16-year strategic initiative. Julian blinked, completely thrown off his rhythm. Excuse me? Her father looked up, a terrifyingly smug smile spreading across his face. The integration project, Julian. Did you really think I just threw my feral, hyper-intelligent daughter at you two boys and hoped for the best? Chloe stepped around Julian, staring at her father in horror. What are you talking about? When you were 8, her father explained smoothly, walking down the terrace steps with the patriarch right behind him. You were brilliant, but you were chaotic. You lacked structure. Julian, you had entirely too much structure. You were arrogant, rigid, and well on your way to becoming an insufferable snob. Hey, Julian protested. It's true, son, the patriarch agreed cheerfully. You were terrible. I hypothesized, Chloe's father continued, gesturing with his silver pen, that if I forced you into close proximity, natural selection would take its course. Chloe, I knew you wouldn't back down from his arrogance, which would force you to adapt and outsmart him. Julian, I knew her intellect would threaten you, which would force you to stop relying on your name and actually work for your achievements. You were the perfect whetstones for each other. Chloe's jaw dropped. You engineered our entire childhood? I merely set the parameters, her father corrected modestly. The fact that you fell in love was a highly probable secondary outcome. Opposites attract, especially when they share an underlying competitive neurosis. I predicted a romantic entanglement by age 22. You are technically a year behind schedule, but I will allow it. Julian stared at his father. You knew about this? Of course I knew. The patriarch laughed. Your father and I have had a standing wager for a decade. I bet on you two getting together after you came back from boarding school. He said you'd wait until after university. The patriarch pulled a crisp $50 bill from his pocket and handed it to Chloe's father. Well played, old friend. Chloe stood frozen in the courtyard, her brilliant, analytical brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the two men standing in front of her. You, Chloe stammered, pointing a finger at her father. You used my life as a behavioral psychology experiment. And you, she rounded on the patriarch. You bet on it. It was a very sound investment strategy, her father noted, tucking the $50 away. Julian suddenly started laughing. It wasn't his polished corporate chuckle, but a real, deep laugh of absolute disbelief. He dragged a hand down his face, looking between the two smug fathers and his entirely outraged girlfriend. We thought we were being so careful, Julian said, shaking his head. We hid behind a bookcase in the library last week. I know, Chloe's father said dryly. Your feet were sticking out. I simply pretended not to notice so you could maintain the illusion of rebellion. It's important for young couples to have shared secrets. Chloe let out a sound that was half scream, half laugh, burying her face in her hands. I cannot believe you. Both of you. You are menaces. We are visionaries, her father corrected softly. His smug expression finally melted into something incredibly warm and genuine. He looked at Julian, then at Chloe. I am proud of you. Both of you. You turned out exactly as I hoped. Julian reached out, lacing his fingers securely through Chloe's, a massive weight lifting off his chest. He looked at her father and nodded deeply. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't, her father said, turning back toward the terrace. Now please, stop lurking in the server rooms. The IT department thinks we have a raccoon problem. It's embarrassing. Chapter 14. At 24, Chloe officially completed her advanced qualifications, cementing her status as one of the most formidable technical minds in the industry. She didn't just understand Vanguard's massive data infrastructure. She practically breathed it. Julian, at 26, had been officially named the Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard. He possessed a ruthless instinct for strategy, and the kind of icy corporate composure that made seasoned executives sweat. Separately, they were intimidating. Together, they were an absolute nightmare for anyone sitting on the opposite side of a negotiation table. It was a brisk Tuesday morning when the Partners in Chaos dynamic was put on full, terrifying display. Vanguard's executive board was currently trapped in Conference Room A, enduring a presentation from a flashy Silicon Valley tech startup. The startup was trying to sell Vanguard a heavily overpriced, third-party cloud architecture system. The CEO of the startup, a man named Sterling who wore a turtleneck and entirely too much confidence, was pacing at the front of the room. using words like synergy, blockchain adjacent, and cloud-native disruption. Julian sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. His expression completely blank, his fingers steepled in front of him. Chloe sat directly to his right, casually scrolling through the startup's technical documentation on her tablet. She was wearing a sharp, minimalist cream blazer, looking deeply bored. And so, Sterling concluded, flashing a dazzling smile at Julian, by migrating to our proprietary quantum mesh servers, Vanguard will see a 30% increase in data parsing efficiency. It's the future, Julian. We just need a signature. Julian didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just slowly turned his head to his right. Chloe. Chloe didn't look up from her tablet. It's garbage. A collective gasp echoed around the boardroom. Several older Vanguard executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Sterling's dazzling smile faltered. He looked at Chloe, clearly registering her for the first time as something other than an assistant. I'm sorry, excuse me? Did you say garbage? I did, Chloe confirmed, finally setting the tablet face down on the table. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany, her sharp eyes locking onto the startup CEO. Your quantum mesh is just a rebranded REST API stacked on top of a highly unstable recursive loop. If we run Vanguard's daily transactional volume through this, it will throttle within 4 hours and crash the tertiary servers. Sterling bristled, his face flushing red. Now hold on. Our backend engineering is top tier. I assure you, little lady, the math checks out. The air in the boardroom instantly dropped 10 degrees. Julian's eyes darkened to pitch black. He unsteepled his fingers and leaned forward, his massive frame radiating sudden, lethal energy. Sterling, Julian said, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous whisper that made the hair on the back of the executive's neck stand up. If you ever refer to Vanguard's lead architect as Little Lady again, I will personally ensure your startup is bought out and liquidated by Friday. Sterling swallowed hard, physically taking a step back from the projector. I simply meant. What you meant is irrelevant, Chloe cut in seamlessly, entirely unfazed by Julian's terrifying defense. She tapped the glass of her tablet. Let's talk about your math, since you brought it up. Your classification models for the singular points in your differential equations are fundamentally flawed. You're using a standard Eulerian approach for a system that clearly requires a Hamiltonian framework. It's sloppy. It's not sloppy, it's agile. Sterling argued defensively, sweating now. It's a liability, Julian countered, picking up the thread effortlessly. If her servers crash, my quarterly projections drop by 4%. That's $120 million in lost revenue per hour. And your encryption key is statically generated, Chloe added, shaking her head in disgust. A motivated undergrad could breach this network between classes. I could breach it right now using only my phone and the guest Wi-Fi. Which means your product violates 3 separate international compliance clauses, Julian finished, sliding the contract back across the table toward Sterling. Vanguard passes. Sterling looked wildly between the two of them. They were volleying the destruction of his company back and forth like a highly coordinated, flawlessly synchronized tennis match. He didn't stand a chance. You can't just. Sterling stammered. We just did, Chloe said, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms, her expression utterly dismissive. I suggest you take your quantum mesh and fix the memory leak on line 402 before you pitch to anyone else. Defeated, humiliated, and thoroughly outmatched, Sterling hastily packed up his laptop and fled the boardroom. The remaining Vanguard executives sat in stunned, terrified silence. They had known Julian and Chloe were dating. It was the worst-kept secret in the building since the courtyard reveal, but they had never seen them actively tag-team a problem before. Julian leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs, looking perfectly composed once again. He glanced sideways at Chloe, the corner of his mouth twitching upward into a private, profoundly affectionate smirk. You really could have breached his network on the guest Wi-Fi? Julian asked softly. I already did, Chloe whispered back, a wicked, triumphant spark in her eyes. He left his administrative password set to admin 123. Julian let out a low, breathy laugh, entirely ignoring the dozen executives staring at them. He reached under the table, finding Chloe's hand and lacing his fingers tightly through hers. They were an absolute menace to the corporate world, entirely unmanageable, and completely, perfectly matched. Chapter 15. It was a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon when Vanguard's primary server went down. At exactly 2:14 p.m., the main dashboard in Chloe's office flashed a brilliant, blinding red. Alarms didn't sound, Chloe had permanently muted the auditory sirens because she found them dramatically unnecessary, but the entire data systems team went into immediate, silent panic. Chloe didn't panic. She narrowed her eyes, cracked her knuckles, and opened the master terminal. "Nobody touch anything," she ordered over the intercom, her voice echoing. The code was written in Python. It was flawlessly structured, elegantly looped, and utterly devoid of semicolons. And hidden right in the middle of the script, plain as day, was a print command that simply read, "If you are reading this, you are too slow, Palmer. Decrypt the payload." Chloe stared at the screen. "Julian," she whispered, a mix of absolute fury and profound amusement washing over her. She bypassed the security lock in 10 seconds and opened the payload. The red warning screens across the department vanished, instantly replaced by Vanguard's normal blue interface. The crisis was over. But on Chloe's private monitor, the script resolved into a single, blinking line of text. It was a set of GPS coordinates. Chloe didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys, completely ignored her bewildered development team, and marched to the elevator. An hour later, her car crunched onto the gravel driveway of the main estate. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the immaculate lawns. Chloe walked past the main house, her heels clicking against the stone patio, following the coordinates on her phone until she reached the eastern edge of the property. The oak tree. Standing beneath the massive, sprawling branches of the tree where they had signed their first treaty 16 years ago, was Julian. He had ditched his suit jacket and tie. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and his hands were shoved into his pockets. For the first time in perhaps a decade, the untouchable chief operating officer of Vanguard looked genuinely, undeniably nervous. Chloe stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. She tried to maintain her fierce scowl, but the corner of her mouth was betraying her. "You crashed my primary server," she stated. "I temporarily paused it," Julian corrected, taking a step toward her. "Using a custom script that I spent 3 weeks learning how to write, completely in secret, without relying on brute force processing power." "It was a decent loop," Chloe conceded, her eyes softening. "For a corporate suit." "High praise," Julian smiled, though his chest was rising and falling a little faster than normal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He didn't drop to one knee right away. Instead, he took her hand and placed the object into her palm. 16 years ago, you threw a shoe at a dog from this exact tree, and I realized my entire world was never going to be peaceful again," Julian said, his voice dropping to that low, rough timbre that always made her heart skip a beat. "You completely upended my life, Chloe. You ruined my manners, you insulted my wardrobe, and you constantly make me question my own intelligence." "It's a surrender," Julian murmured, stepping into her space and taking her free hand in both of his. The arrogant, composed air was completely gone, leaving only the man who loved her with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "I have spent my entire life trying to navigate the expectations of my family, this estate, and the corporate world. But you are my true north. You are the only thing that makes any of it make sense." Julian took a deep breath, and finally, smoothly, dropped to one knee in the grass. He didn't pull out a velvet box. Instead, he reached up and pressed a tiny, hidden latch on the side of the brass compass in her hand. The back of the compass popped open with a soft click, revealing a hidden compartment. Resting inside on a bed of dark velvet was a ring. It wasn't a gaudy traditional diamond. It was a sleek, minimalist band of platinum holding a brilliant, custom-cut sapphire that perfectly matched the midnight blue dress she had worn at the Solstice Gala. "Chloe Palmer," Julian said, looking up at her with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "Will you please do me the absolute honor of terrorizing me for the rest of my life?" Chloe stared down at the ring, then at the man kneeling in the grass. The boy who had once demanded she stop rolling in the mud, now offering her everything. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she was grinning so hard her face hurt. "You wrote a custom Python script just to propose to me," she whispered. "I wanted to ensure maximum operational efficiency," he replied, a hopeful smile breaking across his face. "You're an idiot," Chloe laughed, dropping to her knees right there in the grass in front of him, entirely ignoring the stains on her designer trousers. She threw her arms around his neck, knocking him backward slightly. "Yes. Absolutely yes." Julian caught her, letting out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. When they finally pulled apart, Julian carefully took the ring from the compass and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "It's beautiful," Chloe murmured, admiring the sharp, clean lines of the sapphire. Then she looked back at him, her eyes narrowing slightly with that familiar, wicked spark. But if you ever hijack my servers again, I will change your administrative access to read-only for a month. Julian laughed, a bright, echoing sound that filled the quiet courtyard. He leaned in and kissed her, right there beneath the oak tree where their war had begun, officially signing the final, ultimate treaty. Epilogue. 16 years after her father had first dragged her into the main house courtyard, Chloe stood in the very same spot, looking out over the manicured lawn. She was 24 now, sophisticated, brilliant, and fully capable of navigating the most complex social protocols and data structures without biting anyone. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and Julian rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla shampoo. Your father is currently inside telling my dad that this was his master plan all along, Julian murmured, a dry smile in his voice. He's taking 100% of the credit for your transformation. Again. Chloe laughed, a bright, clear sound, leaning back against his solid chest and resting her hands over his. The custom-cut sapphire on her finger caught the late afternoon sun. Let him have his victory. If he hadn't forced me to come over here and terrorize you, I never would have realized how much fun it is to keep you on your toes. You still terrorize me, Julian pointed out, turning his head to press a soft kiss to her cheek. You just do it with better vocabulary and significantly nicer shoes now. Don't test me, corporate boy, Chloe warned, leaning into his embrace as her eyes flashed with that familiar, brilliant spark of mischief from her youth. I may be wearing designer silk, but I still know exactly where the caterpillars live in the garden. Julian chuckled, his hold on her tightening as he looked out over the estate they would one day run together. I know you do. And that is exactly why I am marrying you. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.